Welcome to Kronos Talks, a place for some candid thoughts on what might need to change if we're going to get the worlds of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability to generate positive impacts. I'm Gemma James, I'm Kronos' Head of Biodiversity Nature, and in the third of the trilogy of interviews with the team, I'm with Tanya Cox, a Biodiversity Nature Manager here at Kronos. Tanya is a specialist in oceans and marine plastics and marine conservation issues, and she came to us from Fauna and Flora International, where she led the marine plastics programme, and she also holds a master's in oceanography. So hi Tanya, thanks for joining us today. Probably no prizes for guessing what we're talking about today.
Hi Gemma, no, I'm really pleased to be here. I always love talking ocean, so looking forward to this chat.
So the ocean is, what's the word to describe it? Just huge. It covers 70% of our planet, and we probably haven't paid enough attention to it until probably most recently. There's definitely been some movement in terms of international policy frameworks. Also, the latest David Attenborough documentary probably showed some pretty shocking footage of our relationship with the ocean, but has also probably helped highlight the importance of the ocean. So Tanya, you're going to help us understand the big blue a little bit better. To get us started, can you tell us, how did you become interested in the ocean? From my side, I was lucky enough to visit the islands off the Malaysian Borneo coast a few times in my childhood. And I thought every time I put my head underwater, it was like the Little Mermaid down there. Obviously, we don't have any mermaids or singing crabs, but, it got me interested straight away. So a little bit more seriously, what sparked your interest?
I know, wouldn't life be so much better with singing crabs and mermaids if they were a real thing? But I guess for me, I've always had a real natural affinity for the water and for the natural world more broadly as a child. The coastline and the sea was a big part of my childhood. I spent hours and hours in the water and clambering around the rock pools on the South Devon coast mainly. And I was absolutely fascinated by what I could see and what I couldn't see, more importantly. As you say, the ocean is a huge place. It covers over 70% of the planet. But in our everyday lives, we have such a tiny, restricted insight into what actually goes on there. I remember when I was 10, I was down at the coast for my birthday, and I was treated. It's a coastline I know very, very well. I spent so many hours of my life there, but we'd never seen any dolphins. And there on my birthday was a pod of, I think, 20 dolphins just playing in the water. Had they not breached the surface, we wouldn't have known they were there. And I think that's what always really fascinated me and continues to fascinate me and led me to study oceanography in Southampton. And, I would love to say that it involved lots of sun-drenched beach days on tropical marine conservation projects. It wasn't quite like that, but it did give me a really good grounding in systems thinking and really highlighted how if we change part of one system, it will inevitably affect another, which is a really good grounding in what we do today. I think that most of us learn at some point in our school years about the water cycle and about that land-sea connection. But the ocean connection to land and life that we know is so much more than that. The ocean, the land, the earth, and the atmosphere all operate in one very, very complex and delicately balanced system. And it's that system that sustains life on Earth. And I think it's safe to say that what happens in the ocean doesn't necessarily stay in the ocean. It's ocean processes that generate the oxygen, 50% of the oxygen that we breathe on Earth. The ocean also absorbs, I think it's about a third now of the carbon budget. So really regulating atmospheric systems and climate. And because of ocean dynamics, it also is able to absorb over 90% of excess planetary heat. So as the planet is getting warmer as a result of climate change and man-induced global warming, we're able to regulate the temperature to within that 2% increase, which obviously is still something of serious concern that we've increased by 2%. But without the ocean, the atmospheric temperatures would be some 35 degrees hotter than they are. So it's really important that we understand how the ocean works and how to maintain it and restore it so that we have this careful balance in place for future generations.
So you've highlighted a whole bunch of ecosystem services that, as society, we're really dependent on having a healthy and resilient ocean. But today, do we have a healthy, stable, resilient ocean?
Sadly not, is the very short answer to that. Around the world, over 40% of the population live within 100 kilometres of the coastline, and some 3 billion people rely on seafood for their primary source of dietary protein. We know that the ocean and the ecosystem services that we derive from the ocean sustains the livelihoods of over 600 million people. And a very conservative estimate of the value of the blue economy is somewhere in the region of $24 trillion a year. So there is a really well-established intrinsic link between the blue economy and global economies, which go beyond those goods and services and planetary system stabilizing services that the ocean provides. And it also includes cultural, religious, and health services too. And I think one thing is really interesting in more recent years, in recognition of growing pressures on society and declines in mental health around the world, medical practitioners are increasingly prescribing time in the blue, time at the coastline where possible, as an alternative to reliance on medication for things like depression, because there are such benefits that can be derived from exposure to the sea. A healthy ocean ecosystem is really fundamentally important, but we're not really seeing that. The ocean is becoming increasingly unstable, and this is largely driven by 3 factors: climate change, overexploitation of marine resources, and habitat loss or change of land use or seascape use are the 3 drivers of ocean decline. And all of these effects are compounded by pollution, both physical pollution from things like plastic entering the ocean, but also the more invisible pollution that's born of chemicals entering the waterways, or even nutrients running off agricultural landscapes, for example, having huge impact on coastal and offshore environments. As a result of climate change, the warming of the planet is obviously melting polar ice caps, which is a well-known phenomenon and has been documented for years. But the warming of the planet is also resulting in marine heat waves, which is happening at a rate that we've never experienced before on the planet. So as the water is heating up, yes, the ice caps are melting, but also we're seeing things like mass mortality of different fish species, bleaching corals at rates that have never been seen before. And this increasing temperature can also have impacts on different marine species. So, for example, turtles. I was lucky enough to spend a number of years working in turtle conservation. And turtles, as you know, they nest on beaches. And the temperature of the sand can affect the sex of the juvenile turtles that are born. So hotter nest environments results in more female baby turtles, and cooler temperatures result in more males. So obviously, as we're heating up, if the planetary temperatures are causing more females to be born, that has knock-on implications for populations in the future. The hotter waters also hold less oxygen. So the animals that are requiring oxygen to breathe in the water are under more respiratory stress, which actually draws more oxygen from the water, so further depleting the level of oxygen in the water. And this has got really long-term implications, because the ocean as a 3D structure, there's surface circulation, there's mid-water circulation, then there's very, very deep water circulation. And this deep water circulation operates extremely slowly. We're talking timelines of over thousands of years. And so as warmer, less oxygen-rich water descends into the deep over this timeline, it means that the oxygen levels in different parts of the ocean, as the water moves across all the different ocean basins, it can't replenish oxygen levels elsewhere. So it has future implications for different ecosystems that rely on oxygen, obviously. And then the other thing that you might have heard about in relation to climate change impacting the ocean is that it's becoming more acidic. So, as I said, about a third of the anthropogenic produced carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans. as carbon dioxide dissolves in the water, it's turning the water more acidic, which is dissolving the shells of different animals that live in the water and also affecting structures like corals. And corals are really important from an economic point of view because they're nursery grounds for a number of commercially important fish species. They are the most biodiverse ecosystem in the ocean. And I think one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, actually, holding about a quarter of all of the marine species known to exist in the ocean. So when we start seeing bleaching events or dissolving coral skeletons as a result of the water becoming more acidic, it really has broad implications for future health of marine populations. When it comes to fisheries, we know that over 90% of fisheries are fished at or over sustainable levels. And it's not only just fishing effort that has increased to unsustainable levels, it's also fishing practice, increasingly. And this is something that I think was really highlighted extremely well in the recent David Attenborough documentary Ocean. We're looking at such huge industrial scale fishing now with often very, very damaging techniques like bottom trawling that result in huge quantities of bycatch that aren't used or sold as part of the catch. They're lost to the environment. And I think the example in the documentary that really, really struck me was the scale of the krill fishing in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, when you see these huge, great big vessels working on industrial factory levels, really capturing krill and then processing them directly in the ocean. I think suffice to say that there are a lot of issues facing the ocean, and I think that the most recent estimates in terms of value at risk from these drivers of decline sits in the region of $8.4 trillion, which could impact up to 66% of globally listed companies and their investors and their insurers. So I think that there's a real need and a real opportunity for ocean-dependent businesses and investors to really pay close attention to these issues in light of the significant risks.
I think, a lot of companies and investors that are already assessing their impacts and dependencies or nature loss in their portfolios, they'll probably be familiar with some of these drivers that you're mentioning. They at a higher level concept, they shouldn't be anything new. They're probably looking at them at a terrestrial level, but maybe not necessarily at that for the ocean. But is there anything that's going to give us a little bit of hope here? What are some of the solutions that we could be aware of?
Yeah, there is definitely hope. And that is the good news, that although I may have painted a pretty dire picture of the health and the future of the ocean, what is really quite amazing, and again was captured in David Attenborough's documentary, the ocean has a really incredible ability to restore itself. And we're not talking multi-generation timeframes within which those changes can be seen. It can happen within decades. It can be as quick as that. So fully protected areas, for example, and no-take zones, which essentially means areas of the ocean where fishing activity and extraction is either fully prohibited or significantly reduced for large portions of the year. These protected areas, or MPAs as they're known, are known to restore fish stocks and marine habitats to really healthy levels because the pressures are removed for short periods of time. Fish stocks can recover, habitats can recover, they become more resilient, they become more productive again. And what we see is that actually there's this incredible spillover effect that where you have a protected area in one defined place, the sort of neighbouring waters, if you like, the area immediately on the outside, benefits from the spillover of increased numbers of fish and resources into those waters that can still be fished. And in the cases of the high seas, where you have protected areas being established, where larvae and juvenile fish move in ocean currents, they can also reach coastlines and nearshore environments. So again, benefiting fishing communities and coastal communities reliant on them for livelihoods. There's lots of attention at the moment on the ocean and what can be done, because we're halfway through what's called the UN Ocean Decade. And I think having real world examples of solutions that are effective and achievable within relatively short spaces of time is absolutely the message that we need. All too often, the scale of the challenges that the natural world is facing and the rate of decline of biodiversity that we're looking at seem like insurmountable challenges, but they're not. And I think that what the documentary did very well is highlight those examples of how positive action can be taken and the benefits can be felt by all stakeholders.
So then the question is, what kind of investments actually needed in order for this to actually take place?
Well, that is the million or trillion dollar question, should I say? So as I mentioned, we're halfway through the UN Ocean Decade. Protecting and restoring biodiversity to increase the resilience and recovery of the ocean environment is a key theme that cuts across all of the different ocean challenges within that framework. And although we can see some progress, it is clear that a lot more is needed to affect the scale of change that we're talking about. And that, of course, means investment as well in the blue economy. Because although the figures for the blue economy that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the 24 trillion that the ocean economy is thought to be worth, a lot of that is still generated by activities that can be having a negative impact on the marine environment. So what we actually need to be thinking about is how do we transition investments away from impacting activities towards more sustainable, more regenerative ocean activities. And I think that sustainable investment is certainly something that's needed to drive that change. We know that the Sustainable Development Goal number 14 is the only one dedicated to the ocean. It's called Life Below Water. But we know it's the most underfunded of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2024, the State of Finance for Nature report estimated that investments from both public and private sectors into nature-based regenerative solutions needs to quadruple by 2030 to the tune of some $300 billion. That's across both terrestrial and marine realms. But that is some significant investment that we're talking about. So we do need to see more stakeholders engaged on this issue and committing funds to start driving this change. And I think over the next 5 years, it's going to be really critical that we see that coming so that we stand a chance of reaching the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, and the targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework, such as protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030.
Do you have any examples of where that investment is being made? So either a company or countries?
Yeah, we're seeing more examples in this space coming to light now in terms of sustainable blue finance, things like blue bonds or debt for nature swaps. And I think in terms of countries leading in this space, one of the examples that comes to mind is the Blue Bond Initiative in the Seychelles, where the country committed to establishing a vast marine protected area around the islands in partnership with conservation bodies so that they can measure and monitor the impact of conservation activities and the benefits that that brings to the ocean economy in and around the Seychelles. And increasingly, there's also more and more focus on ocean economic sectors through things like the TNFD and the Science-Based Target Network, SBTN, both of which have included ocean issues and are also publishing new guidance on specific ocean industries like fisheries to help set science-based targets to allow companies to avoid and reduce overexploitation of marine resources and to protect habitats and reduce risks to different marine populations.
On the lead up to the UN Ocean Conference this year, I mean, we saw a lot of these different funding mechanisms and the guidance and structures being in the news. I think at that conference, amongst other things, there was a lot of focus on the High Seas Treaty. I was wondering, how important is it for issues like overfishing and habitat restoration that that treaty gets ratified and implemented?
I think that it's actually really important because, as I said, this intrinsic link between climate and ocean and biodiversity is really coming to the fore. And I think it's widely accepted now, and the science certainly shows that unless we act on the ocean, we're not going to meet our climate targets. And so the policy that you mentioned, the High Seas Treaty, or the areas beyond national jurisdictions, which means anything beyond a country's boundary. So Ocean governance is quite a complex thing. I think there's over 600 different pieces of legislation governing the ocean, which makes it very, very difficult to understand and interpret. But essentially, a nation or a jurisdiction has got control of its waters up to the 200 nautical mile limit offshore, in simple terms. Anything beyond that is known as areas beyond national jurisdiction, or the high seas. And up until now, these are areas of the ocean that have absolutely been out of sight for most of us, and certainly out of mind for many. There's lawless state, if you like, that are controlled by nobody but used by everybody. And so the importance of the High Seas Treaty is that for the first time, there is an international commitment to sustainably manage the marine resources within these high seas areas, to reduce overexploitation from high and heavy fishing practices, to ensure that protected areas can be established and maintained and monitored by all nations through a collective agreement. I think it was 20 years in the making, this piece of legislation. So the adoption in 2023 was a really, really landmark moment. And now we're in what's called the race to ratification. So by September 20th, we need to have 60 different countries committed to ratify this piece of legislation in order for it to move forward to implementation phases. And I think 51 of the 60 countries have agreed to ratify. So that explains the focus in Nice, which, and by the way, the theme for the UN Ocean Treaty was "Let's be Nice to the ocean," which I think is absolutely brilliant. But the focus of the discussions and the negotiations in Nice were really to try and drive that final support for ratification of the treaty so that it can be implemented. Because it's through the High Seas Treaty that we will stand a chance of reaching the 30 by 30 targets that are included in things like the Global Biodiversity Framework, where we're looking to protect 30% of land, waters and seas by 2030 in order to restore biodiversity and to increase resilience and restoration of natural ecosystems.
And we mentioned fishing, but also there's other industries. Like I was just thinking about deep sea mining, for example. A lot of that happens outside of those national jurisdictions. So there'll be other sectors and activities that are going to be impacted by this treaty as well.
Absolutely. It's got quite far-reaching implications. Yes, deep sea mining is one of them, because a lot of the materials that are being sought after from deep sea mining activities are found in high seas areas. And one of the elements of the treaty is that any industrial process needs to demonstrate no negative impact. So in other words, a full environmental impact assessment as such will need to be completed before any deep sea mining activities can take place in and below these high seas waters, which I think is really crucial and not necessarily something that's been done to date. And that's one of the reasons that there is quite a lot of controversy surrounding this particular industry sector at the moment. And one of the reasons for the precautionary pause, the moratorium on deep sea mining, was because more evidence and more information was needed about the potential impact, and not just the immediate impact, but the long-term implications. Because as I explained earlier, things in the deep sea move very, very slowly over very long time frames. So we need to consider immediate impact, yes, but also what does it mean for future sort of circulation in the ocean body as a whole. Another area that is quite interesting is the extraction of marine genetic material, and equal access and equal rights to extraction of marine genetic materials, which is something that will also be under the terms of the High Seas Treaty, which is quite interesting as well, because I think the question of equal access, both from a decision-making point of view, but also from a maintenance and a governance of the ocean point of view, is really fundamental. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, over 600 million people around the world rely on ocean industry for their livelihoods, and absolutely have to have a voice at the table on how these resources that are common goods, up until now, that's exactly what the high seas represent. They are common goods to all mankind. And so we really need to make sure that there is equitable resource sharing brought about by the terms of the treaty.
Another topic that has impacted everyone, again, in the planet in different ways is plastics. The final negotiations towards the Global Plastic Treaty are on the way. I know, Tanya, that this is a topic very, very close to your heart. You've done a lot of work on it in the past.
I think for me, what's really interesting about the Plastics Treaty is that the resolution to negotiate the text actually stemmed from recognition of the impact that marine plastic pollution was having on biodiversity and coastal communities. But over the years and over the process towards the final goal, what's become very apparent to everybody and is widely backed up and reinforced now by science is that actually we're talking about something much, much wider than a plastic pollution issue or a waste management issue. We're talking about a systemic issue, a system-wide problem where plastics and the chemicals used in them are fundamentally out of sync. It's not a sustainable system anymore. In my lifetime, the amount of plastic that's produced in a year has increased 20-fold, and it's now surpassed 400 million tons a year. And I think the most recent estimates are something like 76% of this is accumulating in the natural environment, because most of the plastic that we make and use has got such short-lived lifespans. It's used once and then discarded, but it doesn't go away. And most of what we produce is not recyclable with today's technology. So I think that the Plastics Treaty, because the mandate was to take a life cycle approach and consider all factors that contribute to the downstream pollution problems, I think it's really important and really will be very key to addressing the problem by taking that holistic systems-based thinking approach. But as a result, it could well impact a number of different businesses, a number of different sectors, hopefully for the positive, but changes will need to be made in the way that we make, use and dispose of this material.
You've mentioned science and data quite a lot in this podcast, and obviously it's something that is important when we're assessing, the impact, the dependencies, the measuring and the monitoring of these different issues. Obviously, we want an evidence base and a baseline to go from. However, I would say that often we hear it's quite limiting, at least from an investor standpoint. We're often said that, there's not enough data out there. I was wondering if you could explain what is out there in terms of data availability and the quality of that data.
Yeah, it's true that everybody always wants more data. And it's also true that ocean data is really complex. We're talking about a fluid, with no pun intended, a fluid three-dimensional environment where ocean science spans biology, it spans chemistry, physics, geology, biogeochemistry, and then social science disciplines as well. So there is a huge amount of knowledge and a huge amount of data out there. But how do we use it is the question. And crucially, how do we make it decision useful data? And I think that this is something, since joining Chronos, I've been really interested to see where that train of thought is going. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of scientific data that's available. There's a lot of really valuable data that's held by Indigenous peoples and local communities that needs to be listened to and incorporated into decision making. And then there's a lot of privately held data as well by different companies, for example, that operate in or near the marine environment, that have been doing their own research for a number of years. And so I recently met Hub, who are launching an ocean data portal, which I think is really interesting because they're trying to compile this very, very broad range of data and different data sets into one useful, decision useful portal for people in, for example, the finance community. And I think it's also really helpful that groups like TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, are also starting to include ocean-related dependencies, impacts, and then corresponding risks and opportunities into their model. And they're issuing sector-specific guidance, because I think the thing that's really useful about TNFD is that it really recognises that the ocean's not a homogeneous environment and that the issues are transboundary. And as I described, this ocean governance landscape is very, very complicated. And so by issuing sector-specific guidance, it allows different businesses and different investors to take a more focused look at their operations and their portfolios to understand where in their either direct operations or indirect operations they may be dependent on the ocean and maybe having an impact, and what are the opportunities and risks that come out of those dependencies. So TNFD has just issued guidance on fishing, on marine transportation and cruise line industries, and SBTN has also just issued guidance for ocean industries like fisheries, to help companies set science-based targets, again, in line with the data that's available.
So from what I'm hearing from you is it sounds like, we could have not enough data, but actually there's also the risk of having too much data. But really what we want is actionable data. So it sounds like it's, really exciting time to be working on this topic. What I'm hearing from you, Tanya, is there's some data out there, there's guidance out there to get started. So really everyone should be or could be looking at assessing their impacts and dependencies on the ocean to at least some extent. And as you say, TNFD and SBTN are really good starting points. So hopefully that leaves our listeners with some food for thought. I think we'll probably wrap it up there. We always love a good pun in the team. So maybe shall we commit to do another podcast at some point so we can dive deeper into impacts and dependencies for relevant sectors?
Always happy to swim through these topics with you, Gemma.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Tanya. It's been really great having you on here.
Thanks very much. It's been great.
So thanks for listening. If you haven't caught the podcast with our other members of the team, Laura Fox and Rebecca Drury on regenerative agriculture and wildlife trade, do take a listen. Also take a look at our website, chronosustainability.com, for more information on the work of our Biodiversity Nature team and other episodes of the Chronos Talks podcast. And follow us on LinkedIn via the handle @Chronos Sustainability for all our news and updates.